Audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, we are live now. I will ask Basha to introduce her forum, please.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the team, Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 71 lecture of the lecture series on this platform. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of the academic study of Indian languages and literature envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. Later in 2005, a new department was established which continues to carry on with the research in Indian languages. Calcutta Comparatives 1919 took inspiration from this history and it's a platform for sharing research interests and ideas. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Thank you for joining us today. In today's session, we will listen to Professor Avishek Parui and Professor Merin Simi Raj. The title of their talk today is The Episteme and the Ontology of a Center for Memory Studies. Now, I'd like to request Aratrikadi to introduce Dr. Parui and Dr. Shimiraj. Over to Aratrikadi.
Thank you, Purvasha. Thank you for this lovely introduction. Both Professor Parui and Professor Merin Simi Raj, they are the principal and the co-principal investigators of the Center for Memory Studies. It's an it's a project at IIT Madras. One of its kind, the center is doing some excellent research work in the field of memory studies. And this joint session will introduce the field of memory studies and will aim to foreground the philosophy, practices, and current research that inform the founding activities from the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras. I'll introduce our first speaker, Professor Avishek Parui. He is an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, and also an associate fellow at UK Higher Education Academy. He did his PhD in English Studies from Durham University. He is a member of several prestigious institutions like Memory Studies Association, MSA, and like I said, the Associate Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy, and many more. One of his forthcoming publications is The Cultural and Literary Matter, Metaphor and Memory, that will be published this year only. And in 2018, he published Postmodern Literatures, Literary Context series from Orient Black Swan. He has also contributed to several journals like Rupkotha Journal on Interdisciplinary Studies in Humanities, South Asian Review, Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies Journal, and many more. Professor Parui also regularly writes for the Telegraph and APW. He also received several awards, like the Durham University Learning and Teaching Award. He also received the Meenakshi Mukherjee Award in 2019 by the Indian Association of Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies for his best published paper in South Asian Review. He has also delivered invited lectures in various universities. And now I'll introduce our second speaker of the day, Professor Merin Simi Raj. Professor Merin Simi Raj is also an assistant professor in IIT Madras. She did her PhD from IIT Mumbai in literary historiography of Indian English fiction and critical examination. Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Yes, okay. Now, ma'am has also received various awards, and some of her famous, prominent publications are like it's happening.
You're entirely audible, Aratrika. You can just carry on. You're absolutely audible.
My end, I can't see anything from my end. That's why I'm very sorry. Yes. So ma'am has written for EPW. She has written for Taylor and Francis. She has written for Muse India and many Cambridge Scholars Publishing and many more. One of our forthcoming publications is The Understanding Anglo-Indian Identity that was co-edited with Robin Andrews. Some of her research interest includes literary historiography studies, Indian and post-colonial writings, Anglo-Indian studies, Kerala modernity, and many more. She was also MA project coordinator of HSS department for 3 consecutive years. And she was also the editorial member of the editorial board in International Journal of Anglo-Indian Studies from 2018 onwards. Thank you, Professor Merin Simi Raj and Professor Avishek Parui for joining us today. This virtual floor is all yours now, and we'll have a joint session for one of the first of its kinds in Calcutta Comparatists. We never had this kind of joint session, and we are waiting for you to talk. And please, you can start your lecture now. Thank you
Thank,
so much, both of you, for joining us today.
thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Can you just confirm? Yes.
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Actually, there was some network issues
Perfect.
from my end only.
Yeah.
Sorry
Thank you.
for the interruption, ma'am.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Aratrika and Purvasha. It's always a pleasure to be associated with a society from Calcutta. You from Calcutta University, which is my alma mater as well. I did my MA from Presidency. I used to be a college at that point of time, but there was something called MA through Presidency from Calcutta University. It's more complicated than it sounds, but it was way back in the last decade. But it's always good to reconnect. And I'm very glad and very honored to be invited by you and your society. And I look forward to a continuing engagement with Calcutta Comparatists in the times to come. So the title of the session today, as you mentioned, is the epistemology and the ontology, the episteme and the ontology for a Center for Memory Studies. So because this happens to be a joint session, we thought we would make it sort of symmetrical in quality. So I'm going to talk about the ontology of memory studies in terms of the theoretical background, the philosophical background, what we do as a discipline, and then Merin can come in later and talk about the activities of the Center for Memory Studies. So I'm going to take the first 15 minutes and then I'll hand it over to Merin. She will talk about the Center because she's the one of the investigators in this research center, and she's at the helm of most of the activities which we happen to do. So I'll start off with a basic question. What is memory studies? What is it that we do in memory studies? What constitutes the discipline in memory studies? So, as a very title, as a very name suggests, memory studies, it is a very organically interdisciplinary field. It draws on psychology, both cognitive and clinical psychology. It draws on philosophy of mind, as you can understand. It draws on cultural studies, urban geography, archaeology, and also literature, which is where we come in. And of course, there are different subdivisions and different other vectors that we keep connecting to, like, let's say, machine studies, post-humanism, AI studies, and all kinds of things. So memory is something which is a very, very big umbrella, which is one of the beauties as well as one of the challenges of this discipline. And it is often very attractive to be sort of swayed away by all this disciplinary investments. But at the same time, we need to define a certain kind of ontological framework in terms of what we do, in terms of what is a discipline about. So one of the paradoxes of memory studies as a discipline, and this is something which I have mentioned several times elsewhere, so some of you who have attended my sessions earlier, this might come across as repetitive, but I can't emphasize this enough, so I will say it again. One of the paradoxes of memory studies is we are actually more interested in the phenomenon of forgetting rather than remembering. So what is it that we forget? How does forgetting happen? And why are certain things forgotten? Why are certain events forgotten compared to certain other events? Why are certain figures forgotten? So forgetting, as most of you would know, those of you who come from cultural studies would know immediately, forgetting is oftentimes a cultural activity, which is sometimes politically motivated, ideologically motivated, culturally motivated, and also culturally constructed, right? So forgetting, in other words, is not an innocent or passive activity, but forgetting can often emerge as an act of production, as a productive activity, as a manipulative activity that can be used collectively as well as in more intimate spaces. Now, one of the key things which we are engaged with in memory studies is to look at the micro and the macro models of memory in terms of how the brain remembers, the micro model, the embedded quality of memory. How do, let's say, neural engagements happen? How do neurons remember? How does the brain remember and forget simultaneously? And also, how do cultures remember and forget simultaneously, right? So that's a macro model. That's a more extended model. And a large part of memory studies is invested in the interface between the micro and the macro models in terms of how the brain remembers, how the mind remembers, how the individual, how the subject remembers, and also how the collective remembers, right? And of course, it doesn't need to be mentioned that in a digital age today, in a post-internet age today, the very ontology of remembering and forgetting has changed, has been revolutionized for better or worse. That's a different debate to be had. But the very politics of memory, the very politics of remembering and forgetting, they've changed. So we are moving more and more into a more prosthetic, performative quality of memory, where machines remember for us. I mean, each one of us, we are hooked to our smartphones. Every time we wake up in the morning, we switch on our smartphones. We actually never switch off, but we look at our smartphones and we are reminded of different things, to different kinds of media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all these different vectors. They remind us of what we did 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Photos keep coming back at us. So there is this very undead quality about identity in a post-digital world. Identity, images, events never die. There is this very sort of Dorian Grayish quality about events and images in a post-internet world. They never go away, right? Images always stay. This is undead, spectral, permanent quality about memory, right? Even if the human being dies, even if the organism dies, there is this massive inorganic apparatus which will remember it for you forever, right? So there is a very big research on that. So, what is the politics of remembering and forgetting in a digital age, right? In a post-digital age? The very ontology of remembering has changed. We don't need our brains to remember. We have this prosthetic devices, smartphones, laptops, computers, everything. They can remember for us. So remembering has become a more distributive phenomenon, a more distributive activity. Now, when I mentioned that I'm going to talk about a little bit about the philosophy of this discipline, what I should also sort of mention and define at a very fundamental level, that memory operates as all of us would know in different degrees. The memory operates through primarily 3 stages: encoding, consolidation, and retrieval, right? So the brain first encodes information. So when you see something happening in front of you, if there's an event around you, an emotion around you, if the brain remembers it, it'll begin to encode it. So there's neural encoding which will happen in the brain, right? So the encoding, if it becomes a long-term memory, it'll become consolidated. That's the next phase, consolidation. And then, of course, the act of remembering happens, which is retrieval. So this is a 3-tier phase: encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. Now, even a very cursory glance at this model of memory would reveal that this is a very slippery process, right? So the moment we say something is being encoded, what we also should recognize is that something is also being de-encoded, something is being left out, something is being excluded, right? So every act of encoding also entails an act of exclusion. It's like drawing a map, right? So again, there's a lot of work done between cartography and memory, and of course, the entire research and partition can be read that way. What are the land masses that are included and which are excluded, and of course, how does forgetting and remembering happen around spatial lines, around sort of boundaries or spatial boundaries and maps, etc. Right? So, but the fundamental thing is every act of remembering, every act of encoding, every act of map making also includes exclusion. and I'm deliberately using this paradox, it includes exclusion, right? So memory, in a certain philosophical sense, can also be seen as a production of absence. It's not just a production of, event, it's also a production of absence. Certain things must be forgotten, certain things must be de-encoded. They don't go into the next phase, which is consolidation. And of course, retrieval also is a slippery phase. So whatever has been encoded is not entirely retrieved, right? So every act of remembering will include slippages. Right? Every act of consolidation will include slippages, and of course every act of retrieval would automatically include slippages. Now what that tells us is there is a certain plastic and textual quality about memory, and of course there's a lot of work done on plasticity. So plasticity, for example, is a very loaded term in cognitive neuroscience. They talk about synaptic plasticity in terms of how the more plastic our synapses are, the better we are remembering. So synapses, of course, are the zones between neurons, and modern neuroscience reveals to us today that the real encoding happens between neurons. It's not just in the neurons, but it's between the neurons, that interstitial space between neurons. So as we can see, there's a very postmodern model of memory which has sort of emerged over the years in neuroscience. So memory happens between the neurons, between the interstitial space between one and the other. So that gap is where memory takes place. So synaptic plasticity is a very important concept in neuroscience, and those of you interested in that, the obvious figure to go to is Joseph Ledoux, who's got a really interesting book called The Synaptic Self. I really recommend it. So he talks about how the entire experience of the self, the entire phenomenon of the self is a product of synapses. It emerges out of synaptic plasticity, out of synaptic activities. And Ledoux also has a very important concept or theory of memory, which is the reconsolidation model of memory. Now, what that essentially says is that when you remember something, we don't remember the original event. We remember the last remembered version of the event, right? So as you can see, there's a slippery textual quality in every act of remembering. So every act of remembering draws from the earlier act, right? So it's not just the origin, there's no originality. So what it does is it does away with the fantasy of originality, the myth of originality. There's no original point of remembering. So every act of remembering draws on the earlier text, right? So every time you remember something, you draw on the earlier text. And of course, that act of remembering then becomes the model for the subsequent act. So there's a sequential textual quality of remembering. And that is the reconsolidation model, the reconsolidation theory that is proffered by Joseph Ledoux, right? And of course, the other important thing that Ledoux is famous for is the concept of chunking, right? chunking, chunking. And Ledoux, again, is a very interesting theory where he says that memory operates through chunks, chunking of information. And this is exactly what I was trying to talk about when I mentioned the phenomenon of encoding. So every act of encoding is an act of chunking. Certain informations are chunked together, processed together. What it also means is certain other bits are chunked out, right? And of course, the chunks keep operating as little units of memory, units of sort of engrams, they call it in neuroscience, encoded information, right? So, and interestingly, and this is why the convergence with fiction becomes interesting, the very title, the very concept of chunking is also used by cognitive narratologists such as David Herman, right? Who's got this really interesting book called Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind. Again, I recommend it very, very heavily. It's called Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, where Herman talks about how storytelling also is an act of chunking. So every time you tell a story, you chunk certain information in a way which becomes a plot, right? So the very politics of plot formation is the politics of how you encode the information, how you encode that event and put that into a story. So there's a very interesting cognitive convergence between memory and storytelling at a very neural level and also at a very performative level. If you look at the brain as a performative machine, if you look at the act of storytelling as a performative activity, we find out how the process of encoding and implotment happen in both occasions. Now, with this in mind, with this is very neural and psychological and brain-centered, etc., let's see how we can map this into a more cultural framework, into a more cultural studies framework, the more macro framework, the more macro model of memory, as I mentioned at the beginning. So every culture, as you all know, every nation, every national memory, every national history, every cultural history would have certain events which are constantly re-encoded and retrieved. So we have, memorial lectures, we have remembering events, we have big events which are remembered every year, we have anniversaries of events, memorializations, etc. The grand, proud events of any nation's history, etc. But equally, there will be events in every national history which will be forgotten or chunked out, right? Or which did not enter the encoding process. And this is where memory studies comes in. So we look at forgetting as a politically, agentic activity, as a politically productive activity, as a manipulative activity. How do certain collectives forget or are made to forget? And every nation's history, every collective history would contain these details about how this memory and forgetting are not really ontological opposites, but are cognitive and cultural components of each other in very, very, sometimes very, very political ways. And one obvious book that displays this and dramatizes this, as most of you would have read it, is Milan Kundera's The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, where he talks about how forgetting can become a subversive activity. It can also be totalitarian activity, how a state will make you forget. He talks about Czechoslovakia, post-communist Czechoslovakia, how certain events are forgotten, are wiped away from national history, how certain buildings are wiped away, are renamed, and how architecture becomes a very interesting example of memory and forgetting. And the way Kundera brings in forgetting is interesting because it almost has a Derridian quality to it, because there's a spectral quality about forgetting, right? There's this ontological quality about forgetting, something which is forgotten but never quite goes away. Right? It is still there as a ontological presence, as a lingering presence somewhere, and that can be resurrected at any given point of time. So just like memory and forgetting are connected activities at a neural level, we would argue from a memory perspective, the memory and forgetting are also connected activities at a cultural level, at a more macro level, a more collective level, right? So this is where our research comes in, and Merin will talk more about what we do in terms of activities, but this is a philosophical framework. And the reason why people like us in literary studies are so interested in memory, and also why we are sort of collaborating with, let's say, one of our partners in Chennai are the TCS people. They have an XR lab. They work in augmented reality, extended reality, mixed reality. The reason why we collaborate with them, or they collaborate with us, is because fiction as a medium is a very unique and fluid form which can accommodate and articulate this mixture of remembering and forgetting, right? Because there is an inherent ambivalence about fiction. It has a sort of non-dualistic quality in which absence and presence can be simultaneously articulated and accommodated without prioritizing one over the other. So the very medium of fiction, the very ontology of fiction, the literary fiction becomes a very unique sightline, a very unique perspective in terms of understanding how brains remember and forget, and also in terms of understanding how cultures remember and forget. So with that short preamble, which hopefully has defined the philosophy of our discipline, I hand it over to Merin, who will talk more about what we do as a center. So Merin,
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Aratrika, and thank you, Calcutta Comparatists Group, for your kind invitation. So we are very happy to do this joint session on behalf of the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras. So having outlined the epistemological, having outlined the ontological frameworks within
I think we are having some network issue. Please bear with us.
We have some network issues. We are very sorry for this interruption. Professor Parui and Raj are trying to join again.
Hi, Aratrika. Are we audible now? I think there was some technical glitch.
Yes, you are audible, ma'am.
Yes. Right. So shall we continue?
Yeah.
Yes. So it is also important for us as a center to outline some of our epistemic practices on which most of our activities and our research projects are founded. So to give a sense of the kind of work that we have been doing, as it has already been mentioned, there is an active interface with technology that we have been trying to maintain. So I would like to quickly show you this postcard, which is an AR animated postcard. There's a QR code at the in the corner, through which we can download an app, and this image will get animated. Yeah. So to give a context of this work, this AR animated mural artwork, this is something that we did in collaboration with the XR lab at TCS based out of Chennai. So we have been working in collaboration with the XR lab to generate such work which would also bridge the gap between academy and industry. So this was a postcard which we also generated as part of our first Memory Studies conference at IIT Madras, where we looked at the Jallianwala Bagh event after 100 years. 2019 was the centenary year of Jallianwala Bagh event. So we looked at that event and tried to engage with history from an experiential point of view. It was a retelling in an immersive form. It was a sort of a storytelling which also made history private and public at the same time. So let me try and quickly share my screen to give you a sense of, to take you through the various epistemic practices that we have and the ways in which that has informed the activities of the center. So, yes, could you quickly confirm if my screen is visible?
Not yet, Merin.
No, ma'am, it's not visible.
Yes. In fact, it's not allowing me to share the screen.
Please use the share option.
I am using it. So when I'm trying to share it, it is saying the browser can't access the screen. So it's fine. We'll continue nevertheless. Right. So yes. So fundamentally, one of the things that we have been trying to do was to depart from most of the Western Eurocentric frameworks which we're looking at memory. This does not essentially mean that it's a rejection of the Western models. We've been trying to depart from the more dominant ways in which memory has been looking at history, events, public and private memory, collective memory, and most of these the things within which fall within the gamut of memory studies. So we've been trying to depart from these dominant models, just so there is sufficient space, there is sufficient room to accommodate the practices and locations which are primarily from the post-colonial spaces and also from other spaces, other locations which are fairly less represented or in some cases quite underrepresented as well. So the way we have been trying to work is as to operate as a nodal center where we could bring together various scholars and various networks which are working in different parts of the country, and also simultaneously facilitate an interdisciplinary as well as an active academia industry interface. Yeah. So we've been operating through conferences, through workshops, through training sessions, through reading groups, through discussions, and also majorly through the kind of resources that we've been trying to share with other scholars who are interested in this domain. So our entry point into this field has been through various directions. So as we mentioned in the first half of the session, primarily we are rooted in literary studies. We try to work with and around the frameworks which are available as part of literary tools, and from there we try to access to various industries, to various other forms of disciplinary frameworks as well. So something that we are primarily invested in that sense is also storytelling, the different modes of storytelling. So storytelling for us does not entail just the textuality of it. We are also looking at the material markers. We are looking at the technological interfaces. So storytelling, and we also, as part of the collaborative work that we are doing with TCS, the Excel Lab and TCS, we are also looking at something known as spatial storytelling. Yeah, that's where we try and use our expertise that we have in digital humanities, and we are also building an Excel Lab within the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras. So we are trying to make use of these various tools without necessarily compromising the fundamental epistemological practices that have informed our as part of our disciplinary training. So we do encourage this dialogue across and between various sectors, and our work in that sense does not have a hierarchy in terms of, we just do not prioritize one kind of narrative over the other. We do not try to prioritize one kind of tool or one kind of interface over the other. So for us, technology in that sense is an enabler, just the way the printing press was an enabler to the various academic practices. So we look at technology as an enabler, as not something that would fundamentally threaten or something that would eventually subsume the other practices that we have been continuing with. So there are some major strands that have informed most of our researches from the center. So primarily we look at the processes of encoding and effacement, as it was outlined very detailed in the first half of the session. So we look at fiction as a medium for remembering and reconstructing selves, events, and histories. So it is a way in which we also realize that the private and the public come together, and there are these various interfaces which accentuate and which as well as accelerate this sort of coming together of these various verticals. So what we are most interested is in also the experiential retelling of the everydayness of history. So there is no hierarchy in terms of prioritizing certain kinds of events over the other. So trauma is not defined on the basis of the kind of effect that a certain incident, certain event, or certain historical instance had on the collective of the nation, but more in terms of how it impacted the everydayness and how that everydayness continues to inform the ways in which we identify ourselves, we remember ourselves. So at various levels, the acts of remembrances that we are looking at, it is also about how these narratives, how these identities are constructed, reconstructed in fiction, in history, in media, in urban geography, and also in technology, because technology is also now almost like an extension of ourselves, almost like an extension of our identities. So at some level, we look at technology and the machines which are available for us as extensions of ourselves, where at some points even the human body begins to operate as a machine. Human body also begins to operate as another memory machine, facilitating all of these activities. Yeah. So the other thing that we have been in terms of our research investments, we're looking at historiography and identity as a transnational experience. So one of the projects, the ongoing projects that we have had from 2017 onwards, is our work on the Anglo-Indian community. So it is it's a community which was originally a product of miscegenation, and it is a product of colonialism and post-colonialism at the same time, and it is very transnational in nature. So one of our interests is in looking at these transnational experiences and identifying the best way in which one could capture this story, capture this identity. So when we talk about the transnational capture, what also gets foregrounded is that there is no one single narrative, there's no one single document, one single archive which one can access. So memory becomes the only archive which could tie these different strands across nations. So when we talk about transnational experiences, we are also trying to continue as well as depart simultaneously from a number of prevalent Eurocentric epistemic models. So when we say that, again, we reiterate that it is not essentially a rejection of all epistemic practices which are currently prevalent, but it's a departure which will also ensure a continuity with our engagement with modernity, our engagement with colonial modernity. So it is from this unique location that we have been trying to present our research. We've been trying to formulate the projects that we currently have. So imperialism as well as post-colonialism in a transnational framework becomes all of these say frameworks become very important for us to define our work. Yeah? So we have also been trying to link these fundamental aspects with medical humanities, with digital humanities, with heritage and museum studies, which is also an ongoing work, which the details of which will soon be shared in our website, which you can access later on. And we're also interested in digital archiving. One of the recent projects that we acquired it is with a publishing house based out of Chennai, Anglo Inc., which is the only publishing house which deals with the Anglo-Indian narratives. So we are trying to digitally archive the material which cannot be published in a conventional way. So we will be archiving a number of markers, tangible as well as intangible markers. We will be curating a number of stories which cannot otherwise be captured within the space of our usual academic engagements. In terms of the research activities that we have a number of PhD scholars working with us, a number of MA students who are doing projects with us. So some of the, we'll just quickly talk about some of the important projects that we have from the center. We're looking at the narratives produced from Kerala Jews, the Jewish community in Kerala, looking at the narratives, the textual narratives as well as the memory narratives available from those specific locations. And there is a lot of work on colonial modernity and the engagement with collective as well as individual memory that we have. We're looking at certain very specific local locations. For instance, we have one student who was working on colonial modernity in Kerala, another student currently looking at the formations of modernity in 1940s in Madras. But at the same time, we also have works looking at the evolution of individual memory in a cosmopolitan landscape, and also a number of works looking at the notion of intimacy and collective memory in 21st century world literature and British literature. Yeah? So there is a kind of, we are trying to bring together a number of strands which otherwise may not sit together well in other frameworks. So for us, memory studies is this space where a lot of theoretical frameworks, a lot of interdisciplinary engagements can come together to retell a story of culture, retell a story of nation, which is otherwise inaccessible or otherwise less foregrounded in many locations. To quickly outline the kind of growth that we have had, we started as a research cluster within the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras from the end of 2017. So we very soon grew into a network, an institute level network, a memory studies research network, where we also started dialogues with the other researchers working from different domains outside of humanities and social sciences. And by 2020, we got listed in the Memory Studies Association based out of Amsterdam. That was our first, that we also got recognized as the first memory studies network, not just in India, but also in South Asia. So by 2021, we were also invited to be on the advisory. Dr. Parui was invited to be on the advisory board of MSA, after which we also got this recognition from the AMHRD. One of our projects, which is the current one, the Center for Memory Studies, got approved under the Institute of Eminence scheme. So we are now operating as a center under the MHRD. And very recently, we're also very happy to share this news with you that we are now recognized as the Indian Network of Memory Studies. We are a national network now, working in collaboration with MSA and also trying to bring together the other researchers and other scholars who have similar interests within this within the national network. So we do have ongoing international collaborations and a few industry projects which we are currently working with the University of St. Andrews. They have a Cultural Identity and Memory Studies Institute. We also have an MOU that we signed recently with the University of St. Andrews, which will also facilitate a number of joint programs in terms of offering short-term and long-term programs. So we are working with the University of Warwick. They have a memory group with whom we had a couple of sessions in terms of reading groups, in terms of showcasing the research from their end as well as from our end. So we will also be all of these details will be available in our website as well. And we do have an ongoing collaboration with the Frankfurt Memory Studies platform, which is also one of the most pioneering networks in terms of memory studies, and we have been interacting and working and collaborating with Professor Astrid Earle, who is the founder of the Frankfurt Memory Studies platform and also one of the most renowned figures in memory studies research. And we, as part of the Anglo-Indian research, the research on the Anglo-Indian community that we had been doing, we are continually have been working with the University of Mercy. They have a social anthropology program, which is also very interdisciplinary in nature, where our engagement with the textual narratives and their engagement with the anthropological elements have been brought together. So the one of our recent works from the center was published by Palgrave Macmillan, and it is on Anglo-Indian identity, which is also incidentally the first of its kind work to look at the Anglo-Indian community, to look at the Anglo-Indian narratives from different disciplinary points, also foregrounding the need to have the tool of memory to engage with identity, to engage with this transnational narrative. So as part of our industry projects, we are working with XR Lab Tata Consultancy Services, through whom we have been interacting with their client partners who include the KLM Dutch Airlines, and we've had discussions with the Marks and Spencer Group, and we are also in conversation about a number of other projects which would emerge out of these collaborative initiatives. We would like to quickly wrap up by sharing with you some of our outreach activities and the resources that you can access through our website. We have been trying to offer workshops and public lectures and webinars in addition to the MOOC courses, where the regular MA courses are also offered. We try to look at most of these texts through the lens of memory studies. Yeah, so we can access these details from our website. We've also been trying to facilitate a number of reading groups within the academic circles that are in touch with us. So with this we will wrap up our joint session. Thank you for this opportunity, and please write to us with possible projects or any kinds of suggestions that you might have as well. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Haratrikati, are you here? I think she's having some network issues. Okay, so can we take a few questions, if you permit?
Yeah, we can take a couple of questions when we have another meeting at 11:30, but we can take a couple of questions, yeah.
Okay, so I'll show the questions on the screen. This is from Tanzanian girl. Since you mentioned memory as having a spectral character, does the ghost stories of a culture have something to do with the way a community remembers or repress certain things?
Yeah, shall we take one more question, then we can respond together, maybe?
Okay. So next question is from Mridula S. is there a scope for conducting research intersecting food studies and memory studies? For example, food and taste as a trigger of memories. If so, can please you elaborate on it?
Yeah, great.
There are two more questions. If you
Yes, okay. Can you club it together? We can respond together then. Yes.
okay. So I'm reading them out. Next question is from Ranganath Thakur. Memory can also be manipulative or distrustful. So please give some light on the authenticity of memory. And the last one is from Kashyopi Ghosh. When you talk about AI, machine studies, do you think that the real nature of human memory has been compromised with? For example, when we type an email, there are automatic word generations and suggestions which make it so problematic. So these are all the questions that we have.
Great. Thank you. These are excellent questions. So, Merin, if it's okay with you, I can take the first two and you can.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to remember the questions as best I can. But thank you for excellent questions. The first question is really it's a very political question about ghost stories. And I think ghost stories have a spectral quality which is quite political and it sort of enters into the collective unconscious in a way which is intergenerational as well as quite cognitive in quality. So the ghost becomes sort of metaphors of certain kinds of emotions, metaphors of forbiddenness, metaphors of fantasy, metaphors of transgression, metaphors of lawlessness, metaphors of danger, of subversion. So every culture would have its unique ghost stories, and the spectrality of the ghost stories, interestingly, can be mapped into the post-digital world, where everything is essentially a ghost, right? So there's this undead quality about the digital world that I mentioned, that no images die in a digital world, right? Even if the person dies, even if the events die, even if the sentiments die, the images will always stay and they'll always find a way to resurface, right? So this permanently spectral quality about the post-digital world, I think, has a lot of convergence with the oral tradition of ghost storytelling. I think it's a really excellent question because I think the collective unconscious, which is created by spectrality, in a way is intergenerational, but at the same time, as I mentioned, it has a certain degree of plasticity to it, right? So ghosts can operate as subversive figures, ghosts can operate as liminal figures. There's a very strong liminality about ghosts, something between presence and absence, which is where memory operates. So I think it's a very core question, it's a very core component of memory, the ghost stories, because in a certain sense, every story is a ghost story, right? Every story which is told orally is a ghost story. It's about dead people, right? So the very ontology of ghost story is very, very uniquely, compatible to memory studies, because every story, in a certain sense, is a story about dead people. Is a story about something which happened in the past, right? And I'm guessing most of you are Bengali speakers over here. So the very ontology of bhut, bhut being ghost, bhut being past, is something which is a very interesting spatio-temporal convergence, which can be mapped onto memory studies. So that's a really good question. And a very strong affirmative to that. Yes, it's a very strong function in memory studies, and it should be looked into in more details. The second question, food and memory. Yes, again, excellent question. In fact, one of my PhD scholars is working exactly on that. She's working on Kerala Jews, and in terms of how markers of food, and not just in terms of smell and sense, but also the ritual of preparing and consuming food, how that becomes a marker of memory. Because again, food has a very interesting liminal quality. It's something, especially in memory studies, it's something that we eat personally, it's something which triggers our senses and would know the Proustian Madeleine cake. By the way, if anyone hasn't tasted Madeleine, please don't do it. It's absolutely terrible. I once tasted Madeleine cake, thinking that it's going to be wonderful, but it's actually just so terrible. I wonder how Proust remembered something nice after eating that cake. It's a disgusting piece of cake. But anyway, to each his own. But food obviously has a sensory function, and we all know through sort of neuroscientific research today that the sense of smell and hippocampus, which is a memory center, they're very closely connected. as a result of which smell is a closest trigger to memory, right? More than any other sense, smell is the closest trigger to memory because zonally and spatially, the sense of smell and the sense of memory, which is hippocampus, are very close, very proximate to each other. So there is that private sensory quality about memory, which is there in food, but also at a more collective level, the rituals of making food, the rituals of naming food, the rituals of consuming food, right? So the entire grammar of consumption, the entire grammar of preparation, those become very strong markers of collective identity, especially diasporic identities. Right, so almost every post-colonial studies would know, would have a lot of emphasis on food preparation. And again, the ritualistic totemic quality about those preparation and consumption has a lot of resonance with memory studies, especially the way it is done today. So thank you for those two questions. I think Merin can address the two other questions.
Yes. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm glad that you asked this. Memory can, of course, be manipulative and distrustful because there is no way in which any kind of memory can be seen as entirely trustful or entirely trustworthy or entirely free of biases. Yeah. So fundamentally, all kinds of memory, whether it's private memory or public memory, it is all biased. It could be manipulative at so many levels. Some kinds of manipulation and some levels of distrust which operate, it could lead to visible consequences. That is when we deal with it in political ways, we deal with it in academic ways. Yeah, but at a fundamental level, this is something that we have been very conscious of and very aware of in all the kinds of work that we do from the center too. Yeah, we are entirely aware of the trust factor, the lack of the trust factor, or the varying degrees of the trust factor in all kinds of research. So one of the things that we could do as academicians is to be conscious of this and not to take up to take this aspect as a fundamental premise, because there is nothing which is devoid of biases in this in any kinds of human existence. There's nothing which is devoid of biases. Everything will be intermediated, everything will be mediated, everything will be in various forms polluted by various other things. Yeah. So this is there's nothing called the authenticity of memory. So which is why we also emphasized in our discussion that there is no hierarchy that we are trying to maintain over here. We are just trying to put everything out there. Yeah. And it's not upon us as an academician to make any sort of value judgment on which one is an authentic memory. But the most important thing is to make space for all kinds of memories to be visible, to foreground all kinds of memories, irrespective of the locations, irrespective of the media through which they are narrated. Yeah? So I hope this responds to your questions too. So the next one I think was about the technology, about the real nature of human memory being compromised with. So we essentially also believe that with technology and with modernity, the real nature, if at all there is a real nature of human memory, it was always compromised with. So technology and modernity at various levels have always been messing up with human memory, for lack of a better word, from time immemorial. If we could give a few examples, printing, the same example that we mentioned during this session, printing, which when it made this entry as a technology, it was seen as less organic, less trustworthy than the manuscripts which were in circulation during that time. In fact, there were a lot of suspicion about getting a printed book because that was seen as less original, just the way, at a later point when the photographs were seen as less original than a painting. So this is something that that we need to negotiate with as and when, human civilization goes forward. And we do not, as we mentioned during the session, while we are talking about artificial intelligence or machine studies or any kind of new interventions, new interfaces that technology is offering, we are not trying to prioritize one over the other. Because if you talk about the way in which human memory has been compromised,
I think they are having some technical problem again.
So they are frozen. Let's wait.
Hi, can you hear us?
Yes.
Merin, are you?
She has left. I think she will join again.
Right.
So, Professor Parui, we have another question. Would you like to answer to that while she joins?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, so the question is there any scope of studying the intersection of disability studies and memory studies? If yes, then please throw a light on it.
Yes, it's a very important question. I mean, I think Merin mentioned that one of the convergences we have is with medical humanities, and there's a lot of work done on medical humanities and memory studies together. And the whole idea of being differently abled, I think that becomes a very important part in memory. There's a lot of work done on Alzheimer patients suffering from schizophrenia, but also people who are differently able, and how being differently abled is not necessarily a lack or an absence, but it produces alternative models of memory. Right? It produces sort of sometimes subversive, sometimes playful, and sometimes interrupted notions of memory. And again, one could go back to partition and partition literature to talk about how being differently abled, in a way, a differently abled subject, a differently abled body remembers events is completely different from the way mainstream memory operates. So I think there's a lot of research that can be potentially tapped into looking at the intersection of disability studies and memory studies. So yeah, my answer will be a very strong affirmative. I think Merin's back, so if you could just wrap up your response, Merin.
Right, yeah. So what we were trying to argue is that we do not essentially believe that the real nature of human memory is getting compromised with these interventions. Of course, there is always a judicious discretion that one must exercise, but otherwise this is something that we should learn to live with, we should learn to negotiate with. And we also believe that technology is definitely an enabler. Technology makes because our journey through modernity is, in fact, a journey through technology itself. Yeah. So because the fundamental nature of human memory, there could be, a lot of flaws with the fundamental real nature of human memory as well. And technology, in fact, if you look at, the way in which we now use our phones, yeah, it's an extension of our identity, it's an extension of ourself, and there are ways in which the identity is very intricately related with the way technology has been shaping our lives too. So this is not essentially, we are not essentially trying to foreground one kind of practice, one kind of tool over the other. The point is that it is very important to arrive at this convergence where more visibility to different public as well as private memories, different public as well as private histories, yeah, could be given in the larger scheme of things. Yeah, right. Okay. Thank you. So.
Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. We don't have any more questions, so I think we can conclude the session as you have a meeting. So thank you for joining us, and thanks to the participants for those amazing questions and for watching. Okay, so we can conclude the session. Purbashadia, thank you to you also. So
Thank you for
we are
having us.
concluding.
Pleasure interacting with that. And I look forward to meeting you in person in Kolkata.
Thank you for a brilliant lecture, Professor Avishek Parui and Professor Merin Simi Raj. And on behalf of Calcutta Comparatists 1919 and its members, I would like to convey my heartfelt thanks to Professor Parui and Professor Simi Raj for responding to us and for coming to our forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much.